Podbean, your message amplified.
Ready to share your message with the world? Start your podcast journey with Podbean.
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 Podbean. Podbean, the AI-powered all-in-one podcast platform.
Thousands of businesses and enterprises trust Podbean to launch their podcasts.
Launch your podcast on Podbean today.
My school uses Podbean.
My church, too.
I love it. I really do.
You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium. Available on Apple Podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean, and most other podcast platforms. This episode is about the Cottingley Fairies. So it's over to you now, Mark, for this week's Tinkerbell's Tale.
The Cottingley Fairies were the subject of a hoax in 1917 which purports to provide evidence to the existence of fairies. They originally appeared in a series of 5 photographs that were taken by 2 young cousins, 16-year-old Elsie Wright and 9-year-old Frances Griffiths, who both lived in a small village called Cottingley in West Yorkshire near Bradford in England. When the photographs were published, they immediately came to the attention of the well-known writer Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who then used them to illustrate an article on fairies that he had been commissioned to write for the Christmas 1920 edition of the Strand Magazine, with Doyle also interpreting the photographs as clear and visible evidence of a supernatural phenomena. However, the reaction of the general public was very mixed, with some accepting the photographic images as genuine and others believing that they had in fact been faked. Eventually, interest in the Cottingley Fairies gradually declined after around 1921, but Elsie left open the possibility that she believed she had photographed her own thoughts, and this once again meant that the media became reinterested in the story. But in the early 1980s, both Elsie and Frances eventually admitted that the photographs were faked, using cardboard cutouts of fairies copied from a popular children's book of the time. However, Frances maintained that the 5th and final photograph was in fact absolutely genuine. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in once again and listening to this supernatural being episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a medium, a ufologist, a true crime buff, and a man with a very dark and disturbed sense of humour who wonders if people are born with a photographic memory or if it just takes time for them to develop. But just to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every week, usually on a Tuesday night, although occasionally on a Wednesday, allowing for bank holidays and busy weekends, I do a podcast on the many wide and various subjects that fall under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters, and all sorts of other paranormal phenomena, including true crime, unsolved crime, serial killers, the darker side of some past celebrities, and the occasional missing person that often goes unnoticed. So, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review or an opinion of the episode subject that I can reply to, a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell. Or if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. And if you do get a few minutes spare, perhaps you might like to check out some of my social media groups and pages, including Facebook, Instagram and TikTok, which are filled daily with all things unexplained and crime. I'll put the links to some of my socials in the description. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the visual art story surrounding the Cottingley Fairies. And this week's necessary disclaimer: Well, it is a pretty easy-going episode this week, so nothing to worry about. However, as usual, 1, you do listen at your own discretion, and 2, all opinions and comments are strictly my own. However, the facts of the case, or fiction, depending on your point of view, of course, still remain. I also apologise if I pronounce anything incorrectly. My English, although it is my first and only language, made me realise just the other day that getting to work on time makes that day really long. But anyway, let us get back to the story. Cottingley is a suburban village within the city of Bradford district in West Yorkshire in England, between Shipley and Bingley in the United Kingdom, with it being clustered around the original St Michael's Church, which is now the Cottingley Town Hall, and is 2.5 miles, or 4 kilometres even, from Bingley, with the Cottingley Bridge a mile closer than that. The village of Cottingley itself was first mentioned in the Domesday Book back in 1086 as Cottingley, and is part of Bingley Rural Ward on Bradford City Council and part of the parliamentary constituency of Shipley. And at the 2011 census, Bingley Rural Ward, which includes Cullingworth, Denham, Harden and Willesden, had a population of 17,895. Sorry, I'll try that one again. It is mid-1917, and 9-year-old Frances Griffiths, along with her mother, both newly arrived in England all the way from South Africa, and was staying with Frances's aunt, who was the 16-year-old Elsie Wright's mother, Polly, in the village of Cottingley in West Yorkshire. The two cousins, Frances Griffiths and Elsie Wright, would often play together beside the stream, or otherwise known as the beck, at the bottom of the garden. However, this would somewhat annoy their mothers, as whenever they played down there, most of the time they would come back with wet feet and muddy clothes. However, one of the reasons the two girls gave for continuously going down there is that they only went to the beck to see the fairies, and to prove their claim, 16-year-old Elsie Wright would then borrow her father's camera, which, for all you camera enthusiasts out there, was a midge-quarter plate, wherein, 30 minutes later, the girls would then return successfully jubilant. Elsie's father, Arthur Wright, was, as you have probably gathered, a keen amateur photographer, so much so that he had even set up his own darkroom, and when he had the picture on the photographic plate developed, it showed his 16-year-old niece, Frances Griffiths, behind a bush in the foreground on which 4 fairies appeared to be dancing. However, Arthur, knowing his own daughter's artistic ability, meaning 9-year-old Elsie Wright, of course, and that she had spent some time working in a photographer's studio, he dismissed the 4 fairy figures as nothing more than cardboard cutouts. A couple of months later, and both of the girls decide to borrow his camera again, only this time they returned with a photograph of not just Elsie sitting on the lawn holding out her hand, but she was also holding out her hand to a 1-foot-tall garden gnome. But, being somewhat exasperated at what he had just developed, he believed that the picture was, and I quote, "nothing but a prank," and was convinced that the girls must have tampered with his camera in some way, so Arthur Wright refused to lend it to them again. However, his wife, and Elsie's mother, Polly Wright, believed the photographs could be authentic. Towards the end of 1918, one of the girls, Frances Griffiths, sent a letter to a friend of hers named Joanna Parvin in Cape Town, South Africa, where Frances had lived for most of her life, enclosing one of the photographs of herself with the fairies. On the back of the picture, she wrote, and I quote,
"It is funny, I never used to see them in Africa. It must be too hot for them there."
In mid-1919, the photographs became public after Elsie's mother, Polly Wright, attended a meeting of the Theosophical Society in Bradford. On an interesting side note here, the Theosophical Society is the organisational body of Theosophy, which is an esoteric new religious movement. It was founded in New York City in the United States in 1875, and among its founders were Helena Blavatsky, who was a Russian mystic and the principal thinker of the Theosophy movement, and Henry Steele Olcott, who was the Society's first president. It draws upon a wide array of influences, older European philosophies, and movements such as Neoplatonism and occultism, as well as parts of Eastern religious traditions such as Hinduism and Buddhism. The founders describe Theosophy as the synthesis of science, religion and philosophy, and notes that the purpose of human life is spiritual emancipation, along with the human soul undergoing reincarnation upon bodily death according to the process of karma, referring to the principles from Indian religions, with the organisation splitting in 1880 into the Theosophical Society both in Adyar in India and Pasadena in California. The lecture that evening at the Theosophical Society in Bradford just so happened to be on fairy life, so at the end of the meeting, Polly Wright then showed two of the fairy photographs that were taken by her daughter and niece to the speaker. And as a result, a few months later, these same pictures were then displayed at the Society's annual conference in Harrogate. And there they came to the attention of a leading member of the Society, a gentleman named Edward Gardner, who, remembering that one of the central beliefs of Theosophy is that humanity is undergoing a cycle of evolution towards increasing perfection, recognised the potential significance of the photographs of the movement, saying of them, and I quote, "The fact that the two young girls had not only been able to see fairies, which others had done, but had actually for the first time ever been able to materialise them at a density sufficient for their images to be recorded on a photographic plate, meant that it was possible that the next cycle of evolution was underway." After this first short break, in part 2, we will look at the initial examinations of the photographs, how the author and prominent spiritualist Sir Arthur Conan Doyle got involved with the story, and more photographs that came to light.
Dare to discover the unknown? Book your own paranormal investigation at HAPRA 2026. The Haunted Antiques and Paranormal Research Centre, HAPRA, are now taking 2026 bookings, and your next supernatural adventure is just a £50 deposit away. New for 2026, we have upgraded. Our location now features improved sound insulation on all our windows, making it easier than ever to hear what should not be there. Bring your team, bring your equipment, explore the unexplained, record the impossible. Limited slots available, so secure yours now. Book now, believe later. The Haunted Research Society Centre.com. I'll say that again. The Haunted Research Centre.com.
The leading member of the Theosophical Society in Bradford, one Edward Gardner, then sent the prints, along with the original glass plate negatives, to a photography expert called Harold Snelling, and Snelling's opinion of the pictures was that, and I quote, "The two negatives are entirely genuine, unfaked photographs with no trace whatsoever of studio work involving card or paper models." However, it is only fair to point out that he did not go as far as to say that the photographs themselves showed fairies, stating that, and again I quote, "These are straightforward photographs of whatever was in front of the camera at the time." And so Edward Gardner had the prints clarified and new negatives produced so they could be more conducive to printing and then be used to help illustrate his lectures that he was going to give around Britain, and so that Harold Snelling, who supplied the photographic prints, could sell them at Gardner's lectures. Probably one of the most influential people at that time to learn of the fairy selfies was the author and prominent spiritualist Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who got wind of the pictures from the editor of the editor of the spiritualist publication that was simply called Light, which was a preeminent spiritualist journal published in England for more than a century. It all started in the June of 1920, when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had been commissioned by the Strand Magazine to write an article on fairies for their Christmas issue, and once he had heard about the fairy photographs, he then went all out to find out more information about them. First by contacting the lead member of the Theosophical Society in Bradford, Edward Gardner, to determine the background of the pictures, and then to write to Elsie Wright herself and her father Arthur Wright to request permission from the latter to use the prints in his article. Arthur Wright was obviously pretty impressed, not only to receive a letter from the prominent author, but also that someone like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was even involved in the whole fairy saga. So straight away, without any hesitation, he not only gave his permission for the publication, but he also refused any payment for them on the grounds that if the pictures were indeed genuine, they should not be soiled by money. Both Edward Gardner and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle then decided to seek a second expert opinion regarding the pictures from the photographic company called Kodak, and after several of the company's technicians examined the enhanced prints, they agreed that, although the pictures, and I quote,
"showed no signs of being faked,"
they concluded that, and again I quote,
"this could not be taken as conclusive evidence that they were authentic photographs of fairies."
And so Kodak declined to issue a certificate of authenticity. However, Edward Gardner believed that the Kodak technicians might not have examined the photographs entirely objectively when he overheard one of them saying, and I quote,
"After all, as fairies couldn't be true, the photographs must have been faked somehow."
So, with this information in mind, the two men then took the pictures to another photographic company to be examined called Ilford, who reported unequivocally that there was, and I quote, "some sign, some evidence of faking," but declined to be a little optimistic about the whole affair. Both Edward Gardner and Arthur Conan Doyle interpreted the results of the three expert evaluations, meaning Harold Snelling, Kodak and Ilford, of course, as two in favour of the photographs on authenticity and one against. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle also decided to show the photographs to the physicist and pioneering psychical researcher Sir Oliver Lodge. However, he also believed that the pictures were fake, suggesting that it was a troupe of dancers masquerading as fairies. It is now a month later, in the July of 1920, and although Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was preoccupied with organising an imminent lecture tour of Australia, he decided to send Edward Gardner to meet the Wright family for himself. By this point, however, 9-year-old Frances Griffiths was living back with her parents in Scarborough, but Elsie's father, Arthur Wright, told Edward Gardner that he had been so certain the photographs were fakes that while the girls were away, he searched both their bedroom and the area around the beck, or otherwise known as a stream, looking for scraps of any evidence of pictures or cutouts. However, he found nothing incriminating. Edward Gardner believed that the Wrights were an honest and respectable family, which, in his opinion, placed the matter of the photograph's authenticity beyond any doubt. He returned to Cottingley at the end of the July in 1920 with 2 W. Butcher & Sons cameo folding plate cameras and 24 secretly marked photographic plates, with the Wright family inviting him to stay with them during the school summer holidays so that the 2 cousins, Frances and Elsie, could take more pictures of the fairies. Edward Gardner said of his stay at the Wrights family home, and I quote, "I went off to Cottingley again, taking the 2 cameras and plates from London, and met the family and explained to the 2 girls the simple workings of the camera, giving one to each to keep. I suggested only the most obvious and easy precautions about lighting and distance, for I knew it was essential they should feel free and unhampered and have no burden of responsibility. If nothing came of it all, I told them they were not to mind it a bit." Up until the 19th of August, the weather wasn't very suitable for photography, and don't forget this was way back in the 1920s, so the anticipation for any pictures was very low, and when the weather did eventually clear up, both Frances and Elsie then insisted that the fairies should not show themselves if other people were watching, so Elsie's mother, Polly, was then persuaded to go and visit her sisters for tea, leaving the girls alone with their cameras. And in her absence, the 2 cousins managed to take several photographs, 2 of which appeared to show fairies. In the first picture, Frances Griffiths is shown in profile with a winged fairy close by her nose, and in the second picture shows a fairy either hovering or tiptoeing on a branch offering Elsie Wright a flower, and then 2 days later, when the girls took the last photograph, it showed a group of fairies in their sunbath. The photographic plates were then packed very carefully in cotton wool and returned to Edward Gardner in London, who then sent an ecstatic telegram to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who by then was in Melbourne, Australia, doing his lecture tour. Doyle then wrote back saying, and I quote, "My heart was gladdened when out here in far Australia I had your note and the 3 wonderful pictures which are confirmatory of our published results. When our fairies are admitted, other psychic phenomena will find a more ready acceptance. We have had continued messages at seances for some time that a visible sign was coming through." Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's article that appeared in the December of 1920 issue of the Strand Magazine contained 2 higher resolution prints of the 1917 fairy photographs and sold out within days of its publication. To protect the girls' anonymity, the 2 cousins, Frances and Elsie, were called Alice and Iris, respectively, and the Wright family was referred to as the Carpenters. And as an enthusiastic and committed spiritualist, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle hoped that if the photographs convinced the general public of the existence of fairies, then they might be more open to readily accept other psychic phenomena, ending his Strand Magazine article with the words, and I quote, "The recognition of their existence will jolt the material 20th century mind out of its heavy ruts in the mud and will make it admit that there is a glamour and mystery to life. Having discovered this, the world will not find it so difficult to accept that spiritual message supported by physical facts which have already been put before it. After this second short break, in part 3, we will look at the general public's reactions to the fairy photographs, the later investigations, the girls' confessions, and where the pictures are today.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07 852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk. Or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future? They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights Ghost Hunting Events. Remember, only the original will do.
Early press coverage of the fairy photographs from the Strand Magazine were generally met with a combination of embarrassment and puzzlement. The historical novelist and poet Maurice Hewlett published a series of articles in the literary journal John O. London's Weekly, in which he concluded, and I quote, "And knowing children, and knowing that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has legs, I decided that the Miss Carpenters had pulled one of them." However, some public figures were more sympathetic with the educational and social reformer Margaret Macmillan, saying, and I quote,
"How wonderful that these dear children, such a wonderful gift has been vouchsafed."
But the novelist Henry de Vere Stackpoole decided to take the fairy photographs and the girls at face value, writing in a personal letter to Edward Gardner, saying, and I quote, "Look at Alice's face. Look at Iris's face," meaning Francis and Elsie's face, of course, but he continues, and I quote, "There is an extraordinary thing called truth, which has 10 million faces and forms. It is God's currency, and the cleverest coiner or forger can't imitate it." Despite all the mixed reviews regarding the first two pictures, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle then used the remaining photographs in 1921 to illustrate a second article that he wrote for the Strand Magazine, in which he described other accounts of fairy sightings, with this article forming the foundation for his 1922 book called The Coming of the Fairies. Even though, just as before, the photographs were received with mixed credulity, along with some sceptics noting that the fairies, and I quote,
"look suspiciously like the traditional fairies of nursery tales,"
and that they had, and again I quote,
very fashionable hairstyles.
Edward Gardner made one final visit to Cottingley in the August of 1921, bringing his cameras and photographic plates for Frances and Elsie. However, neither of the girls claimed to see fairies anymore, and so there were no more photographs. But to be honest, I think by this time both Elsie and Frances were getting tired of the whole fairy business. Youth, eh? Public interest in the Cottingley Fairies gradually subsided after 1921, and Elsie and Frances both found partners, got married and moved away from the area, with each of them living overseas for varying periods of time. But in 1966, a reporter from the Daily Express newspaper managed to trace Elsie, who was by then back in England, with her admitting in an interview which was given that same year that the fairies in question might have been, and I quote,
"figments of my imagination."
And at the same time, she also left open the possibility that she believed she had somehow managed to photograph her own thoughts. And when the BBC Television's Nationwide programme investigated the case again in 1971, Elsie stuck to her story, saying, and I quote,
"I've told you that they're photographs of figments of our imagination, and that's what I'm sticking to."
And in the September of 1976, both Elsie and Frances were interviewed by the journalist Austin Mitchell for a programme that was broadcast on Yorkshire television. And when pressed, both women agreed that, and I quote,
"A rational person doesn't see fairies."
However, at the same time, both of them denied having fabricated any of the pictures. In 1983, both cousins finally admitted in an article published in the Purports magazine called The Unexplained that the photographs had indeed been faked, although at the same time both maintained that they really had seen fairies. It appears that Elsie had copied the illustrations of 3 Dancing Fairies by Claude Shepperson from a book that Frances had brought back with her from South Africa, which was the Princess Mary's Gift Book that was published towards the beginning of the war. They said they had cut out some cardboard figures, added a few wings and supported them with hat pins. Then they disposed of the cut-out figures in the beck or stream at the bottom of the garden once the photographs had been taken. However, the cousins did disagree about the 5th and final photograph, with Elsie maintaining it was a fake, just like all the others, but Frances insisting that it was genuine, with both ladies each claiming to have taken it. But in a letter published by the Times newspaper on the 9th of April in 1983, the photographic expert Geoffrey Crawley explained the final photograph discrepancy by suggesting that the picture was, and I quote, an unintended double exposure of fairy cutouts in the grass. Adding, and again I quote, "Both ladies can be quite sincere in believing that they each took it." Frances died in 1986 and Elsie in 1988. The prints of their photographs of the fairies, along with a few other items, including a first edition of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's book, The Coming of the Fairies, were sold at an auction in London in 1998, 10 years later, for £21,620. And that same year, the photographic expert Geoffrey Crawley sold his Cottingley Fairy material to the National Museum of Film, Photography and Television in Bradford, which is now the National Science and Media Museum, where it is on display. Geoffrey Crawley's collection included prints of the photographs, 2 of the cameras used by the girls, watercolours of the fairies originally painted by Elsie, and a 9-page letter from Elsie admitting to the hoax. And the glass photographic plates that were originally used by the girls, were bought for £6,000 by an unnamed buyer at a London auction that was held in 2001. Sorry about that. Come forward a few years to the 4th of October in 2018, and the first two photographs, meaning Alice and the Fairies and Iris and the Gnome, were sold by Dominic Winter Auctioneers in Gloucestershire. The prints that were suspected to have been made in 1920 for the Theosophical Society were expected to bring between £700 and £1,000 each, but as it turned out, Iris and the Gnome sold for a hammer price of £5,400, while Alice and the Fairies sold for a hammer price of £15,000. And a year later, in 2019, a print of the first of the 5 photographs was sold for £1,050, and a print of the second of the 5 photographs was also put up for sale by auction, but failed to sell as it did not meet its £500 reserve price, with both pictures previously belonging to the Reverend George Vale Owen, who was one of the best-known spiritualists of the early 20th century.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 167, we are going to be looking at Chernobyl. On the 26th of April in 1986, the number 4 reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located near Pripyat, Ukrainian SSR, Soviet Union, now Ukraine, exploded. With dozens of direct casualties, it is one of the biggest nuclear energy accidents ever rated at the maximum severity on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The response involved more than 500,000 personnel and cost an estimated 18 billion rubles. It remains both the worst nuclear disaster and the most expensive disaster in history, with an estimated cost of $700 billion.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, and proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. The pronunciations of all the names of places, though, was all mine. The actors in this episode were Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes and Denise Poolar, with special thanks to Neil Packer and the staff of the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley, and of course a big thank you to everyone for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for Mark's Unexplained World podcast, but if you know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner, including ufology, hauntings, disasters and any other sort of paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime, unsolved crime and missing people, just drop me a direct message and I will see what I can do. I'll also include the name of the person who suggested the idea in the end credits of the podcast, if they're happy for me to do so, of course. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. I thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. No AI was used or harmed in the making of this or any other episode of Mark's Unexplained World. This show and all its contents are covered by the basic copyright of Mark the Medium.